In this video, I'll show you a new idea against the Dutch defense that you can play as early as move 2. This move has been played by Nakamura on Draken, Zhu Zhangyi, Tabatabai, Hodgson, and so many other quite strong grandmasters. And before I share this idea, I think what inspired me to sort of come up with this move independently in my head was that about 15 years ago, there was this book called Dangerous Weapons of Dutch that was suggesting this quite creative move of knight h3, which, yeah, even today is actually not such a bad move. But the idea is basically that you'll go bishop g5, e3, and you kind of go this up with knight f4 and h4, where even though it looks kind of weird, there is a certain harmony to this setup, where you can kind of just develop sort of steadily, either with, say, c4, knight c3, or a knight e2 c3 setup. And you're just kind of well placed to put pressure on their e6 pawn if they do go for a standard plan like d6 and e5, which just is not going to be so effective with the early pressure against the pawn on e6. So this kind of made me think, well, okay, if we're having to move the knight twice to get in the move h4 and this sort of setup, well, why not just play the move h4 immediately? And surprisingly, it turns out the computer actually doesn't mind this move, where, okay, it's obviously not one of the top engine lines like, say, g3 or bishop g5, for example, which are a bit better known, but the move h4 definitely has a very large shock value, and there is an actual point to it as such. And also, when I sort of pick out these sort of surprise weapons to sort of cover them, one of the things I kind of look for is not just the shock value and the objective strength, but also are there a lot of different ways you can play it so that if one version maybe you don't like, you can still play it another way. And that's very true for this line where I'm mainly going to be focusing on the move of h5 here, just because I think this plan of charging the h pawn and using the fawn pawn is kind of the most in keeping with the spirit of the h4 line. But there are a few other alternatives as well that I'll also touch on here before getting into the so I'd consider the main line of h5. And if you're enjoying the video, do make sure to leave a like and also to subscribe if you're new here. So another approach you can play, and this is the one actually that's the favorite of the engine, is to play bishop f4. I'm not going to focus on it as much because I think if you want to play bishop f4, you might ask, well, why not just play this move order and just be a little bit more flexible with this h4 push, which is not the worst point in the world, of course. But it's worth noting that even here, I think that you are going to get a small edge out of the opening here also. And also, I think you'll notice because very few games have been played with this system, it means that you'll often see a lot of novelties as early as move 4 or move 5. So, for example, if Black would have played b6, then one interesting idea could be to play knight h3. And I sort of noticed that this up is in some ways an improved version of the bishop g5 knight f4 one we saw before, where the knight doesn't have to go to f4 because we already played h4 beforehand. And just very easy for us to kind of centralize and just have a very pleasant position just playing in the center. In fact, the play in some ways kind of resembles the English defense with b6 bishop b7, where a3 is a move you will often see in that instance. Now, after e3, if they do play bishop e7, well, then we can play it a few different ways, but the most natural is just reverting back to this plan of h6 and sort of setting up the fawn pawn, because we don't want to let us take on g7, have a big attack on their king. But yeah, after g6, we just have this permanent sort of bone in their throat where they'll have to worry about their king's safety for the rest of the game. And believe it or not, this position actually came up in a correspondence game last year. And that game ended a draw because, okay, it's correspondence. All correspondence games will end in a draw, normally speaking. But I do think white is slightly better, where you could go for either a bishop c4, knight c3 set for fast development, or you can play more subtly with knight d2, or even play some c4 and then knight c3. So there are a lot of ways to play this position. It's actually a very flexible approach we're going for. That by pushing the FH pawn earlier, it gives us room to pick the very best setup, depending on what they play against our H pawn advance. So bishop f4 is one option. Again, knight f3 strikes being a little bit inconsistent, but yeah, this is another way you can also play it. Though I do think the knight f3 version is not quite as good because, well, you don't really want to allow them to play bishop b4 in this sort of check, which would give like a very nice Nimzo type position. But after a3, I do think that the move bishop d6 and getting this sort of creative structure does give black pretty close to full equality. So I kind of would say that if you want to play some alternative to h5 or bishop f4, I do think the move bishop g5 is kind of an interesting approach where you're sort of saying it, okay, you're playing a delayed two bishop g5 system because the move knight f6 is maybe not so ideal. Black here really should play the move of e6 because d5 is just going to give white an improved version of the knight c3 bishop g5 lines because we didn't block our c pawn to attack their center. I mean, you could also liken it to an improved Queen's Gambit declined, where the move f5 is just a bit weakening at the end of the day, especially when our bishop is already outside the pawn chain as such. After the move e6, which is what they should play, there are a few different ways you can play it as white. You can certainly just switch back to playing normally and just making the point that the bishop e7 line is so not great that you can still get a small advantage even with with playing this early h4 bishop g5. And you get quite dynamic play of long castles. But it's also possible to play knight to d2 here and sort of have the option of playing for the e4 break. So for example, if they play h6, then you can sort of take and then play for the e4 push from there. Now black plays perfectly, they probably can equalize with a move like c5 and trying to hold off this e4 push. But there are definitely a lot of creative options. A move like f4 is maybe the one that appeals to me the most, just getting a kind of stonewall type position without the bad bishop. But you could also just play something strategically like h5 and just sort of let the long-term weaknesses kind of speak for themselves in a case like this, and just sort of playing normally from there as white. But if black does play d5 to stop the e4 push, well, I think this position also is quite pleasant for white, where if we're able, let's say, to get in something like takes and c4, we just are kind of exploiting the weaknesses in black structure. And if knight c6, I kind of like bishop b5 as a way to sort of support the c4 break and just get a nice initiative using your lead in development. And we see, yeah, we don't even really notice the move h4. It's kind of a normal position where black has just created some unnecessary weaknesses. So bishop g5, yeah, definitely a reasonable alternative. I think that objectively it probably gives black better chance to equalize in h5, but it's also, again, a way of playing it where you sort of get a very original position. I don't think it's objectively worse than the version with knight c3 and bishop g5. Let's put it like this. It just leads to some somewhat different positions by comparison where your pawn structure is a bit more flexible, but you had to play h4 to get that. With that being said, let's now focus on my main line of the move h5, which, like I said, not the absolute top line of the engine, but I think it's the most in the spirit with our system. Obviously, they can't play Leningrad anymore, so if someone deploys the Leningrad Dutch normally, then this h4 is just an extremely annoying way to avoid it. You kind of force them into the e6 lines from there. And once again, yeah, you've got a bit of a choice where, you could play a move like bishop f4 or bishop g5, but it sort of leaves the question of, well, why did you just play it a move or two earlier? So I'm going to make h6 my main line again, even though if black plays perfectly, they do get pretty close to equality. I think that the move h6 does ask black some tricky questions, and the sort of best moves for black are definitely very, very counterintuitive here. Another approach can also explore is to play knight f3, which is kind of trying to sort of prepare the h6 move for a later point when they don't have, let's say, as good a response as some other cases. But if they do play c5, you can kind of go e3, and this is a completely novel approach that is yet to be played in any games, but which I think does have some merit as well. I think you can argue that with the black king as being weak in the long term, and c5 maybe not completely gelling with black setup, the white probably does have a small edge here. But yeah, after h6, basically in practice, the only move that was played in the online games, at least on my online database on ChessBase, was this move of g6. But I think that g6 is a move we're fairly happy to see. Even a move bishop g5 is also possible if you just want to go for the pin directly, but it probably turns out that playing bishop f4 first is technically the most precise. And it also means you kind of leave that free square available in some lines for the knight to kind of support the bishop and sort of use the sort of near outpost that we have on g5. I mean, here there was a game where white played knight c3, but I do think that the bishop b4 pin is a little bit annoying in that case. I mean, you can still play bishop g5, and you definitely can still fight for an advantage as white, but I think that e3 is just a bit more flexible, where you can even play this move of c4. I mean, here I don't think you really need to stop the move bishop b4 a3, because I think that this sort of is just going to be a nice nimzo for white, where again you've got the fawn pawn. You can play knight e2 to sort of support your knight and break the pin. So on that base, I do think white has got a little bit of an edge to work with, whether you get in knight e2 or a3, or whether the pawns get doubled. I kind of like white's chances either way, just with the bishop pair, the space, and the fawn pawn to work with. So let's look at a few other options. Before I show you what the best line is for black here, which is a novelty as mentioned before, I'll also point out that if they do play g8-6, that it's not like bishop takes 8-6 is an outright mistake, but it's actually just better to kind of leave the pawn there and just wait for a better moment to take it. So for example, if they play, say, d6 and try to play it like a normal sort of Dutch, if bishop g7, we are obviously going to take, and, black's going to lose a tempo with moving the bishop twice, and, we still have the attack on the isolated pawn on the h file, which gives us a very nice advantage. But if you try to develop the queen side instead, you're kind of running into moves like d5 that are also just going to mess up the black structure even more and give white a very nice initiative. So a move like b6 could be considered, but I think after knight c3 that, again, you can take on 8-6, and that will probably be a little bit better for white. You can also play it like a computer and play for this approach with knight f3, which leads to some very weird sorts of positions, but ones where white probably does have some advantage to work with. Again, it just comes kind of hard for black to really develop the pieces without making some sort of concession. But the move that black should play here, and again, I think the odds of someone finding this in the game are very, very low, especially if this comes as a surprise. But it turns out black needs to find the move c5 to have any sort of real chance of equality. And there's actually a lot of different approaches that you can play here as white. In fact, looking now, I can even see it as an approach being suggested by the internet I didn't even consider when preparing the file, where like my main line was, to just play h takes g7, and then, bishop h6, just kind of build up a bit of an attack this way. Now, to be fair, the position, yeah, is one where if black plays this correctly with takes and queen f6, as fun as to have the creative rook lift, yeah, this sort of position is probably only a fraction better for white here. Yeah, black structure is a little bit worse, but other than that, he does have the space in the center, and with one weakness, it's not enough to win the game by itself, to put it mildly. But there are other ways you can play it. I will say the move dc5 is the one the engine is suggesting. But yeah, after knight c3, yeah, black it does have some ideas with knight e4 that I do consider a little bit annoying, and I think I would rather just avoid. But that's speaking, yeah, a little more from a human point of view, I guess. I suppose you could also play knight d2, but again, blocking the bishop maybe feels not entirely in the spirit of the opening, even if it's objectively not so bad. But yeah, there's even another idea as well of knight c3, which I didn't even consider before, which I actually think is a very interesting move as well, just with the idea that if they take, you just get this very nice development. You sort of swing the queen over, and you just get I think, a very easy sort of play. I do think the white has a little bit of an advantage to work with, just with this kind of general attacking stuff. Again, it's completely original. There's no games of theory with any of these ideas. So after c5, like it's already a novelty, which right speaks to how unlikely your opponent will find it. There is one other idea I will mention as well before concluding the video, and this one is more for the Gambiteers, but believe it or not, the move e4 is actually a very interesting move in this position as well. Now, from the computer point of view, it's not as appealing maybe as HG7 or knight c3, but it definitely has some pretty big shock value. And after dc5, if black does play the obvious queen a5 to grab the pawn, computer is saying you equalize with b6, but yeah, the odds of someone finding this are pretty low, if we're being honest. But after queen a5, knight c3, yeah, the idea is you just sacrifice a pawn, but you do get some quite nice play for it. You have a pretty big lead in development. You can either go long castles and play for f3 to kind of open up like a Staunton Gambit, or you can go bishop h6 and just sort of directly go for the black king, which is probably the approach I'd go for. I feel like this probably does give white a little bit of an edge to work with. But the position's obviously very complicated, like anything can happen from here, of course. But I do like white's chances with the black king being out in the open. So yeah, that's kind of the overview of this move of h4 and some of the different creative possibilities that you can play. Just to summarize, you can play it either with going h5 and h6, or you can play, with either a London style setup or a bishop g5 style setup. Again, just adding a bit of a creative spin to some of those systems. So, yeah, let me know in the comments below. What do you think of this new h4 line against the Dutch? Is it something that you'd be willing to try out in some of your own games? Do let us know that, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.